please state your name before you begin, and you have 7 minutes.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. My name is Craig Binning. I'm from a partner at Hemson Consulting. Just before I get into my presentation, a bit of a background on Hemson. We are a firm that specializes in working with municipalities on planning policy, municipal finance, demographic, and economic forecasting. We have extensive knowledge and experience working with development charges. I personally, since 1990, have worked on over 300 development charge background studies, from municipalities as large as the City of Toronto to as small as tiny township in beautiful Simcoe County. Other municipalities include the City of Ottawa, Windsor, municipalities in the Niagara region, North Bay, Niagara Falls, Waterloo, and Kitchener, and many, many more. Our submission, which I hope you have a hard copy of, as well as my presentation, is informed with extensive consultation with our municipal clients, with the Municipal Finance Officers Association of Ontario and AMO, but ultimately the opinions set out in my letter and today are those of Hemson Consulting and myself. I too would like to suggest that the legislation does have some positive elements to it, and we certainly want to work together with municipalities, with the province, and with the building industry to ensure a wide range of housing options are available, that there's housing supply, and that we're building livable, complete communities. However, there are some concerns with the legislation and the potential impact which may be counterproductive to reaching those goals. I would like to highlight 5 of these specific concerns with you this afternoon. They deal with the mandatory phase-in proposed for development charges, and then changes to the development charge calculations, dealing with the removal of housing services as an eligible service, the potential removal of land as an eligible development charge funded cost, as well as growth-related studies, and then finally changing the historic service level from 10 to 15 years. I recognize that some of those are details in calculation, and I just want to highlight those for the Standing Committee. My concern is that the analysis that we've undertaken over the last couple of weeks indicates that the cumulative impact of these changes will be the loss of billions of dollars of DC revenues over the next 5 years to municipalities cumulatively. That will range from tens of millions of dollars annually for smaller municipalities and hundreds of millions of dollars for the larger municipalities here in the GTA and across the province. Without alternative revenue sources or the province providing support to that, my concern is that the impact of that will be an eroding of affordable housing or affordable housing for existing homes, because it will result in significant tax rate pressures and utility rate pressures, and also may result in the delaying of the delivery of important municipal infrastructure necessary to allow for the development of housing. What I'd like to do over the next few minutes is focus on a few of those key things and get into a little bit more detail. Of first concern is that proposed mandatory phase-in of development charges when new bylaws are passed, or what might be referred to as discounts. The concern here is that doing that will result in significant revenue losses to the municipalities, which will place pressure on the utility tax rates and property tax rates without offsetting revenues. Also, I don't consider this to be a phase-in because it actually relates to the entirety of the charge. The minister in the legislation on October 26th talked about the need to make increases more manageable for home builders for development charges, but the discounting applies to the total charge, not just the increase in the development charge. Also, this applies retroactively back to bylaws that were passed in the summer since June 1. That doesn't take into consideration that those bylaws were passed as part of a public consultation period and often in extensive dialogue with BUILD and other representatives of the development industry. And municipal budgets are now based on those rates, and one of the impacts of the mandatory discounts on those retroactive bylaws will result in development charge rates lower than what were originally in place prior to the passage of the new bylaws this past summer. And then one other point, it's interesting to note that the discounting applies to all rates, not just the residential, but also the non-residential development charge rates, and we are wondering how that will help to supply housing across the province and would encourage it not to be applied to the non-residential use. Moving into some of the specifics on the calculation methodology, and I'll try to not get to bore the committees too much, but I want to highlight some of the critical things. Most recent changes to the legislation reinforced that housing services was an eligible development charge service, and municipalities across the province have been using those monies to help deliver affordable housing and work with the private sector for the delivery of those housing. Removing that of a service will be counterproductive in that fewer affordable housing units will be created here in the City of Toronto and elsewhere across the province, including places like the County of Simcoe. And then when we get into the costs that are potentially no longer eligible for development charge funding, things like land acquisition, in which the minister will be able to prescribe services for which it is not eligible, will have a fundamental impact on the delivery of core infrastructure, water, wastewater infrastructure, important emergency services like fire stations and police protection services. And also the removal of growth-related studies. It's critical that municipalities have that revenue source available to them to do proper infrastructure planning in advance of that development occurring. If that funding limitation is removed,
Final minute.
Thank you very much. I'm going to move on to my recommendations then. What I would like to propose to the Standing Committee and to the government is that the mandatory discount be removed, or if it is to be remained, that it be focused on residential development charges alone, and that it relate to the increase in the charges and the phase-in period be discounted. I would also like to request that the definition of capital cost for eligible under the development charges remain unchanged and continue to include land and also studies, and that finally housing services remain as an eligible cost. You may hear from another presenter that municipalities have existing development charge reserve funds to offset these DC revenue losses. I want to stress to this committee that those funds are all committed against existing infrastructure needs and have been fully accounted for in development charge rate calculations. And indeed, some of those reserves are in negative positions where municipalities have in place the infrastructure, and it's important that they be able to continue to fund those.
Thank you very much. I'm sorry your time is up. I'll now move on to the